Egoism that is too subtle to realize you have it, I have it, we all have it. While overt egoism is often easy to identify, a more insidious form persists in daily human interactions, subtle egoism. This paper explores the unconscious expressions of egoism embedded in everyday behaviors, decisions, and self-perceptions. Drawing on psychological theory and observational analysis, the study aims to reveal how this invisible egoism operates under the radar, shaping relationships, communication, and identity without awareness. The findings challenge the belief that only overt selfishness is problematic, highlighting instead that subtle egoism may be more influential and more difficult to dismantle. 1. Introduction. Egoism, traditionally defined as an excessive preoccupation with one's own interests, is often framed in binary terms. One is either egoistic or altruistic. This dichotomy, however, fails to capture the nuanced and pervasive forms of egoism that go unnoticed, even by those who practice them. While overt egoism manifests through blatant self-centeredness, subtle egoism operates quietly beneath the surface, hiding in thoughts, motivations, and unspoken assumptions. This paper argues that subtle egoism is not only ubiquitous, but also socially reinforced and psychologically adaptive, making it particularly hard to detect and even harder to confront. 2. The nature of subtle egoism, expanded. Subtle egoism is not flamboyant, loud, or overtly self-centered. It is quiet, culturally camouflaged, and psychologically normalized. It resides not in grandiose declarations of superiority, but in the micro-moments of thought and behavior that often pass unnoticed, even by ourselves. Unlike explicit egoism, which openly demands attention or praise, subtle egoism cloaks itself in civility, rationality, or even empathy. Because it does not violate social norms as blatantly, it often escapes scrutiny. 2.1 Implicit self-referencing. One of the most common manifestations of subtle egoism is implicit self-referencing, the habitual redirection of conversations, feelings, or situations back to oneself. This is often seen in the well-intended act of sharing one's own experience to comfort others. For instance, when a friend is grieving and we respond with, "I know how you feel, I lost my grandmother last year," the intention may be empathetic. However, the attention subtly shifts from the friend's unique emotional experience to our own. The underlying psychological mechanism is often a desire to establish emotional equivalence, thereby reinforcing the relevance of the self in every narrative. 2.2 The need for moral credit. Subtle egoism also emerges in the form of unspoken expectation of recognition. When we perform acts of kindness or make sacrifices for others, there is often a hidden hope for appreciation, acknowledgement, or moral credit. This becomes apparent when disappointment follows the absence of gratitude. The act, though outwardly generous, is unconsciously transactional. This form of egoism is especially insidious because it masquerades as altruism. The ego remains hidden behind the mask of selflessness. For example, a colleague who helps with a project late into the night might genuinely want to assist, but if they later feel slighted for not being praised in a meeting, it reveals an expectation that undermines the purity of the gesture. The ego was subtly active, looking for validation. 2.3 Narrative centrality and ego as the default lens. Perhaps the most pervasive form of subtle egoism is narrative centrality, the unconscious belief that one's own viewpoint is central, rational, or most informed. This is evident in interpersonal conflicts, where each party tends to interpret events through their own lens, often failing to account for others' experiences or motivations. Subtle egoism convinces us that we are objective observers when, in fact, we are narrators biased toward our own role. In conversations, this may appear as interruptions, unsolicited advice, or habitual one-upping, behaviors rooted in the desire to recenter attention on the self. The ego subtly asserts, "I matter most here," not through dominance, but through quiet self-prioritization. 2.4 Virtue signaling and the ego of righteousness. Subtle egoism can also take a moralized form, virtue signaling. This is when individuals perform moral or ethical posturing primarily to elevate their own image. Whether it is showcasing charitable donations online, broadcasting environmentally conscious choices, or voicing politically correct opinions primarily to gain social approval, the self becomes the hidden beneficiary of moral actions. This form of egoism is particularly difficult to recognize because it aligns with socially praised behaviors. For example, someone may advocate loudly for mental health awareness, not purely out of concern for others, but to craft a compassionate public persona. Here, egoism uses collective causes as a vehicle for personal branding. 2.5. Subtle superiority in humility. Paradoxically, even humility can be a veil for subtle egoism. This occurs when individuals display humility publicly in a way that elicits admiration. The ego subtly says, "Look at how humble I am." This phenomenon, sometimes called humble bragging, is an attempt to receive praise while appearing modest. Example, someone might say, "I can't believe I was chosen as team leader again. I really thought someone else deserved it." While this may sound self-effacing, it still communicates achievement and superiority. It's a strategy for ego preservation that avoids the stigma of overt pride. Subtle egoism, therefore, is not a defect of character but a built-in feature of the human psyche, a byproduct of our need for identity, value, and social belonging. It is automatic, unconscious, and deeply embedded in how we relate to the world. The danger lies not in its existence, but in its invisibility. The less we recognize it, the more it governs our actions. 3. Psychological roots of subtle egoism. Expanded. Subtle egoism is not merely a product of personality, it is deeply rooted in the fundamental architecture of the human mind. It arises from universal psychological mechanisms that govern self-preservation, identity construction, social positioning, and cognitive efficiency. While these mechanisms serve adaptive functions, they often foster an unconscious bias toward the self, leading to egoic behavior that appears rational, normal, or even virtuous. 3.1. The self-serving bias. At the core of subtle egoism lies the self-serving bias, a cognitive distortion where individuals attribute their successes to internal factors, such as intelligence or effort, and their failures to external circumstances, such as bad luck or unfair treatment. This bias helps protect self-esteem and maintain a coherent sense of personal competence, especially in the face of adversity or criticism. For example, when a project succeeds, one might unconsciously overemphasize their own role and downplay the contributions of others. Conversely, when it fails, blame is often directed outward. This automatic tendency reinforces a flattering self-image, often without overt self-aggrandizement, and supports subtle egoistic thinking. "I am capable and right," most of the time. This mechanism is not exclusive to narcissists. It is present in nearly all individuals to some degree. It acts as a defense system for the ego, subtly distorting perception to preserve psychological comfort. 3.2. The fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error refers to the tendency to explain others' behavior as a result of their personality or disposition, while attributing our own behavior to situational factors. This discrepancy further reinforces subtle egoism by creating a false sense of moral or rational superiority. For example, if someone cuts us off in traffic, we may label them as reckless or inconsiderate. If we do the same, we justify it by saying, "I was late," or "it was an emergency." This form of asymmetric judgment elevates our self-perception while diminishing empathy and understanding for others. The ego prefers to believe that our motives are pure, while others' missteps are character flaws. This mental shortcut quietly sustains egoism in social interpretation and conflict. 3.3. Ego defense mechanisms, Freudian and Neo-Freudian perspectives. According to classical psychoanalytic theory, the ego operates through defense mechanisms to manage internal conflict and maintain psychological stability. These include repression, denial, projection, rationalization, and intellectualization, among others. Although often unconscious, these mechanisms serve to protect the self from perceived threats, including criticism, failure, or shame. For example, projection, Attributing one's own undesirable thoughts or feelings to someone else is a classic defense mechanism that fuels subtle egoism. A person who is envious may accuse others of being jealous of them. This not only distances the ego from an uncomfortable truth, but subtly repositions the self as a target rather than a perpetrator. Rationalization, the process of creating logical reasons to justify actions, is another key driver. A person might justify cutting someone off in a conversation by saying, "I was just excited," rather than admitting a need to dominate the discussion. These defenses shield the ego while allowing self-centered behavior to persist unnoticed. 3.4. The illusion of transparency and egocentric bias. Humans tend to overestimate the degree to which their inner states are apparent to others, a phenomenon known as the illusion of transparency. This bias leads us to assume that our intentions are clearly perceived, even when our actions suggest otherwise. Consequently, we judge ourselves by our motives, while others judge us by our behavior. This mismatch allows subtle egoism to flourish undetected. Closely related is the egocentric bias, where people view the world from a self-centered frame of reference and struggle to fully adopt the perspective of others. This bias affects memory, attention, and judgment. For example, in collaborative tasks, individuals tend to overestimate their contributions and believe they worked harder than others. Even in acts of selflessness, the ego often whispers, "You're doing more than anyone else." These biases are not deliberate but systemic, ingrained in the default operation of cognition. They highlight how the mind subtly privileges the self in information processing and emotional interpretation. 3.5. Identity and the ego as a psychological construct. Modern psychology, particularly in the fields of cognitive and humanistic psychology, frames the ego as a construct, a mental representation of the self that helps individuals navigate reality. The ego builds a narrative identity, a story about who we are, what we value, and where we belong. This narrative is reinforced through language, memory, and social interaction. However, because the ego thrives on consistency and coherence, it resists contradictions and challenges. When new information threatens the integrity of the self-narrative, the mind engages in subtle defenses to reject, reframe, or reinterpret it. This leads to confirmation bias, a tendency to favor information that aligns with our pre-existing beliefs and to dismiss disconfirming evidence. For example, someone who sees themselves as a good listener may unconsciously ignore moments when they interrupt or dominate conversations. Subtle egoism, therefore, is embedded in identity maintenance, preserving a preferred self-image, even at the expense of reality. In summary, the psychological roots of subtle egoism are not isolated flaws, but natural byproducts of mental shortcuts, emotional survival strategies, and identity maintenance systems. They operate automatically, unconsciously, and most importantly, universally. Understanding these mechanisms does not eliminate them, but it offers the first step toward transcending their invisible grip. For social and cultural reinforcement, expanded. While the psychological mechanisms of subtle egoism operate internally, their development and persistence are significantly shaped by external social structures and cultural narratives. In many modern societies, especially those emphasizing individualism, competition, and self-expression, subtle egoism is not only tolerated but rewarded. This social reinforcement transforms unconscious bias into habitual behavior, embedding it in daily interactions, institutional expectations, and even moral codes. 4.1. The culture of individualism. Modern Western culture, and increasingly global urban culture, is grounded in individualism, the belief that the individual is the central unit of society. Personal autonomy, freedom of choice, and self-determination are celebrated values. While empowering in many ways, this cultural framework inadvertently promotes egocentric thinking. Children are taught from a young age to stand out, be unique, and express yourself. These affirmations, while intended to build confidence, can also plant the seed of self-importance, subtly reinforcing the belief that personal identity and personal voice must always take center stage. In school, social media, and even therapy, the self becomes the primary subject, the central narrator, and the judge of all experiences. Consequently, individuals learn to filter events, relationships, and conflicts through a self-referential lens. How does this affect me? What does this say about me? What does this do for me? Such questions become default, habitual, and socially accepted, often without recognition of their egoic foundation. For point 2, social media as an ego amplifier. Nowhere is subtle egoism more magnified than in social media environments. Platforms like Instagram, X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok reward visibility, personal branding, and emotional exhibition. Likes, shares, and followers serve as a form of social currency, validating not just content but identity itself. This dynamic creates a performance-based model of selfhood, where people learn to curate their lives for audience approval. Subtle egoism thrives in this space in forms such as virtue signaling, posting about socially approved causes or values to gain social points rather than affect genuine change. Humble bragging, sharing achievements under the guise of modesty to invite praise without appearing boastful. Emotional display as self-promotion, publicly processing personal hardship in ways that elicit attention, sympathy, and engagement. Even when content appears altruistic or vulnerable, the underlying social architecture encourages egoic motivations. What will people think of me if I share this? Over time, the boundary between authentic self-expression and ego-driven performance blurs, and the ego's grip on identity intensifies. For point 3, consumerism and the ego of entitlement. Consumer culture reinforces egoism through the constant affirmation of the self as a deserving recipient of comfort, pleasure, and recognition. Advertising and branding rely heavily on ego-stroking messages. Because you're worth it. Have it your way. Indulge yourself. Treat yourself. These messages subtly but consistently feed the narrative that the individual is entitled to gratification, admiration, and validation. The ego, naturally drawn to self-enhancing messages, absorbs these cultural scripts with little resistance. Consumption becomes not only a lifestyle but a statement of identity, further reinforcing egoic thinking. This also feeds into interpersonal dynamics, leading people to expect ideal treatment, instant gratification, or constant affirmation in their relationships. When these are not received, subtle resentment or moral superiority may emerge. I give so much, but no one gives back to me. This sense of unrecognized generosity is a classic symptom of socially reinforced egoism. 4.4. Workplace structures and the cult of self-promotion. In many professional environments, especially in competitive or corporate cultures, subtle self-promotion is not only accepted, it's often essential. Job interviews, performance reviews, networking events, and leadership roles often favor individuals who can confidently articulate their value and achievements. Phrases like, "you need to sell yourself," or "make your impact visible," subtly shift the focus from contribution to personal branding. While competence remains important, perception of competence becomes a currency of its own. This leads to egoic behaviors such as claiming credit for group efforts, highlighting personal involvement in successful projects, undermining others subtly in order to stand out. Even in team-oriented cultures, the pressure to differentiate oneself quietly incentivizes egoic self-focus under the guise of ambition or leadership. 4.5. Social scripts and politeness as ego defense. In many cultures, politeness and decorum function as social scripts designed to manage interpersonal boundaries. While necessary for civil coexistence, they can also serve as subtle shields for the ego. For example, avoiding difficult feedback by saying, "It's fine," when it's not. Offering praise to others in order to appear generous, while quietly competing. Using diplomatic language to assert dominance or superiority indirectly. These social norms can reinforce subtle egoism by allowing individuals to maintain a superior self-image while adhering to politeness. The ego avoids confrontation, vulnerability, or humility, not through aggression, but through passive tactics and self-protective language. In conclusion, subtle egoism is not merely an internal psychological issue, it is a culturally scaffolded phenomenon. Social systems, from media and education to capitalism and communication norms, implicitly train individuals to think of themselves first, and often, to do so without realizing it. The cultural fabric does not just allow for egoism, it frequently rewards it, as long as it is polite, polished, and well-dressed in the language of self-care, professionalism, or authenticity. Recognizing these reinforcements is essential for those seeking to live more consciously, empathetically, and authentically in a society where the ego, though subtle, is constantly being fed. 5. Consequences in interpersonal relationships. Egoism, especially when subtle and unrecognized, can quietly distort the fabric of our relationships. Unlike overt arrogance or visible self-centeredness, subtle egoism often manifests through micro-behaviors, small, almost imperceptible reactions, assumptions, or judgments that accumulate over time and negatively affect how we connect with others. One of the most common consequences is chronic misunderstanding. When ego subtly drives our interpretations, we tend to misread other people's intentions. For example, if someone offers feedback, a hidden ego may cause us to perceive it as criticism or disrespect rather than support. This defensive lens can lead to unnecessary tension, even when none was intended. Subtle egoism also contributes to emotional distance. People may unconsciously withdraw when they sense that a conversation or relationship is becoming more about power, validation, or being right, rather than mutual understanding. Over time, this pattern can erode trust, creating a quiet but persistent wall between individuals, even in close relationships like marriage, friendship, or collaboration at work. Another serious consequence is the inhibition of authentic communication. Ego-driven conversations often center on self-protection or image maintenance. Instead of being vulnerable or open, we may choose to mask our real feelings or manipulate the interaction to maintain control. This prevents honest, heart-centered dialogue, reducing the depth and sincerity of our interactions. Furthermore, subtle egoism fuels comparison and resentment. We may constantly compare ourselves to others, mentally evaluating who is more successful, more intelligent, or more appreciated. These comparisons not only drain our mental energy but also foster hidden jealousy, competitiveness, and a sense of isolation. Instead of feeling connected, we feel separate, like we're in a constant race to prove something. Subtle egoism also affects our ability to empathize. Ego whispers, "What about me?" even when someone else is in pain. It interrupts our listening and redirects the attention back to our own experiences, often making the other person feel unheard. This reduces the emotional safety needed for a relationship to thrive. In the long run, subtle egoism can lead to relationship fatigue. Loved ones or colleagues may not always be able to articulate what feels wrong, but they will sense a recurring emotional imbalance, an invisible weight that turns connection into friction. They may begin to emotionally disengage, become passive-aggressive, or in some cases, leave the relationship altogether. In summary, the consequences of subtle egoism in interpersonal relationships are profound but often hidden. They include miscommunication, emotional disconnection, erosion of trust, lack of vulnerability, and a reduction in genuine empathy. By becoming more self-aware and identifying the subtle ways ego shows up, we can begin to build healthier, more meaningful relationships, rooted not in self-importance, but in mutual respect and understanding. 6. Recognizing and regulating subtle egoism. Recognizing subtle egoism is not easy, precisely because it doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't make grand declarations like overt arrogance does. Instead, it hides in good intentions, in polite gestures, and even in self-sacrifice. That's what makes it so difficult to detect. But without awareness, we continue to operate from ego while believing we are being humble, rational, or caring. The first step in recognizing subtle egoism is self-observation without judgment. This means watching your thoughts, emotional reactions, and interpersonal patterns as if you were a curious outsider. For example, ask yourself, do I feel the need to correct others often, even on minor points? Do I silently crave acknowledgement, even when I pretend I don't? Do I mentally compete with people in conversations or social settings? Do I struggle to truly listen when someone else is speaking about their success or struggle? Do I get irritated when I don't feel seen, respected, or appreciated, even when no harm was intended? These questions don't mean you're a bad person. They are gentle doorways into deeper awareness. The goal is not to shame the ego, but to understand how it subtly drives us when left unchecked. The second step is learning to pause between stimulus and response. Subtle egoism thrives in automatic reactions. When someone disagrees with you or overlooks your contribution, the ego flares up. They don't respect me, or I have to prove my point. By practicing a pause, just a breath, a second of silence, you create space to choose your response rather than react from a bruised sense of self. Third, practice emotional labeling and inner honesty. When you feel triggered or uncomfortable, label the emotion. This is pride, this is insecurity, this is the fear of being irrelevant. Naming the emotion disarms the ego's subtle grip. It turns unconscious behavior into conscious awareness. And in that awareness, change becomes possible. Next, cultivate humble curiosity. The ego hates being wrong, but curiosity loves learning. So instead of thinking, how could they say that to me? You might ask, what else could be true here? Is there something I'm missing? This mental shift replaces ego defense with psychological openness, a critical trait for self-growth and emotional maturity. Another key practice is engaging in non-egoic reflection. This means journaling or meditating not to confirm how good, smart, or kind you are, but to look honestly at how your behavior affects others. Ask, did I make space for others to speak? Was I listening or just waiting to talk? Did I need to win the conversation or did I prioritize connection? And finally, regulate egoism through consistent inner work. This includes mindfulness practices, compassionate self-talk, and even therapy or coaching if needed. When you develop a strong inner observer, you become less identified with the ego and more aligned with your core values, authenticity, empathy, and presence. It's important to understand that ego itself is not evil. It is a psychological structure designed to protect our sense of identity. But when it runs our lives subtly and invisibly, it distorts how we see ourselves and others. By recognizing and regulating this subtle egoism, we don't erase our sense of self. We refine it. We allow it to evolve from a fragile mask into a stable, integrated self that can handle truth, vulnerability, and growth.